Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rick, the program manager at Republic of Work, and I'm here to kick off today's Lunch and Learn. Just for the visually impaired, I'd like to give a quick description of myself. I'm a Middle Eastern man with dark hair and brown eyes, bit of a scrubby face, the beard, forgot to shave. Wearing a mustard jumper against it, and my background is there's a kid's painting on the wall because I'm using my kid's bedroom, and there's a guitar that my kid is playing, uses, not me, if for anyone else is seeing it. So yeah, I'll finish it at that. And so firstly, I want to thank you all for joining us for this event, and that is so close to my heart. And I'll tell you why in a second. I'm what you call a third culture kid. I don't know if any of you heard this terminology before. So I'm originally from Lebanon, but I grew up in many cities, like Dubai, for example, and I never grew up in Lebanon. So I'm someone who grew up from a different, under expats. Now I'm finally settled in Carsevine, County Kerry, if anyone knows it. I've been very lucky to be immersed in so many cultures throughout my life. But it also meant for a long time that I felt like an outsider at the same time, like I didn't belong at any one place. Like it felt like the experience of exclusion, but there are many forms of that have impacted people in different ways as well, from subconscious microaggressions that wear you down over time to acts of blatant discrimination. When planning today's event, we were lucky enough to be able to draw on the experiences and insights of Doc Patch Labs, DNI from Miriam Sweeney, who is chairing today's panel. Great job. Marianne is joining us on behalf of Doc Patch to partner as our who are also our partner hub from the Irish Tech Hub Network. It's a not-for-profit network of hubs sharing best practices to utilize innovation across Ireland. Before we jump in, I just have a quick housekeeping. A quick note, you can actually show some subtitles if you would like some subtitles by clicking on the live transcript icon at the bottom of the Zoom, and then clicking again on the show subtitles button, and then the subtitles will show. Miriam is actually going to be chairing today's panel, interviewing each of our expert speakers to surface insights from each of them. Following about 40 minutes, we'll switch over to the audience Q&A. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, make sure you drop them into the Q&A box as well, which is also at the bottom of the Zoom window. At the bottom, yeah, and then we'll put them directly in the chat, and then we'll be referencing them to which speaker you are dedicated this question to, if you have specifically to a specific speaker. Our speakers will be drawing on their own experience, as I said, as well as professional work. So please be respectful and open-minded so that we can have a candid and productive conversation. So without further ado, I hand it over to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Rick. Really appreciate you taking the time to introduce us this morning, or this afternoon even. Thank you everybody for being here. So Miriam Sweeney here. I am the D&I lead for Dog Patch Labs and the network manager for the Irish Tech Hub Network. So as Rick had said, we're doing visual descriptions of ourselves today just for additional inclusion for people who have visual impairments. So I'm a brown-haired woman, I'm a white woman. I'm wearing a very bright shirt with kind of turquoise and brown in it, and my background is a blurred out version of my bedroom because I don't feel like anybody needs to see that intimately into my life. But just to kick off today's event, so when Republic of Work reached out to me and asked me to collaborate in this event, I felt it was really important to address the fact that you know, a lot of people feel like diversity and inclusion and the conversation around it isn't very contextually relevant to Ireland, and that we kind of might have a better understanding of issues that are going on in the US and the UK rather than specifically to Ireland. So in general, I think we can all say that Ireland's becoming increasingly progressive, but unfortunately there are still a huge amount of groups who are unfairly disadvantaged in our society. So by the end of today's talk, I'm hoping we can walk away with a better understanding of what diversity means in Ireland specifically, and then also how we can all become better allies to those who are the most marginalised. So today I'm really glad to welcome some of our expert panelists, each of whom has their own specialist knowledge from both their professional work and also their lived experiences to draw from on this topic. So I'm welcoming Mamobo Ogoro, who is the founder of inclusive content creation company Gorm Media. I'm welcoming Claire Kennelly as well, who founded her own disability inclusion consultancy, Inclusive World, and activist Paul McKeown as well, who's proudly hails from the inner city Dublin and is of travelling heritage and is an active campaigner for socio-economic inclusion to be added as a grounds for discrimination into Irish legislation. So speakers, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. So Mamobo, I'm going to dive straight in and just come to you first. So what is it that drove you to set up Gorm Media?
So thanks for that question, Miriam, and I'm so glad to be here. Just a brief descriptor of my background as well. So I am a woman, I'm a Black woman, I am Nigerian Irish, I'm wearing dreadlocks, I'm wearing a yellow top, and my background has plants. I'm in my room as well with plants and some white drawers and white wardrobes, and yeah, that's it. So what drove me to to start Gorm Media? I had the idea in my head for roughly 2 years, but I think it was last year with this rise of social consciousness in Ireland that really kind of was the propeller for me to start Gorm Media. So for those who don't know, Gorm Media is a startup digital media company with a social impact. Our mission is to spark a movement of unity and shared understanding through digital content, and in order to curate common ground through conversations that matter. So what I saw last year was this sort of huge polarization, especially online, when it came to talking about particularly the issue of race and racism in Ireland. So last year, as you are well aware, that we had this sort of large conversation when it came to racism in Ireland due to the impact of Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd in the US. But what I saw particularly in the online space was this really polarized and black and white conversation that lacked a lot of nuance and particularly a lot of contextual knowledge when it came to Ireland as well. So I was like, we really need to start talking about the nuance and experiences in stories, in people's lives when it came to issues of race and racism, and even beyond those parameters as well. So I started Gorm Media, sort of safe space for people to really talk about the issues going on in their community and going on in around Ireland as well. So I started off as a sort of new media sort of project as Gorm TV, which is a web show that dissects the social issues that affect Ireland's multicultural generation. And from there, it kind of propelled into what we're developing now, which is a social enterprise that, again, curates common ground through conversations that matter. And right now we're developing a pilot. We're doing some research and developing a pilot, and we're in the process of making connections, looking for corporate and community partners for the project. And it's just been a great journey because my background is psychology, and it's a great way for me to sort of apply my research and my knowledge as a social psychologist into sort of like the business world as well. So it's a really exciting journey.
Incredible. And I have to say, I'm a major fan of the work that you guys do, like in terms of curating common ground. I think every talk or every, you know, like event that I've been to, it's such balanced discussion around really topical issues that you just don't find in kind of general media today. So kudos for that. But I suppose speaking specifically on the issue of race, so one justification that I'll often hear in sort of like personal context, just specifically, is that, you know, the issue of race doesn't really apply in Ireland because, you know, there aren't that many Black people here, or, you know, others will say racial inclusion is kind of blown out of proportion relative to the number of people of color that are in Ireland. So I think, you know, the 2016 census says it's around 5% of the Irish population identify as non-white. Now, for anybody who's, you know, familiar with racial justice theory, it does seem kind of glaringly obvious why racial inclusion is important, but let's just bring it back to kind of first principles. Why is it important for Ireland to proactively dismantle racism, even if it is only a small proportion of the population that are directly affected by it?
So that's a really great question. I think like I know that racism is a global phenomenon and Ireland is not removed from it at all. So it's not, we can't just say that because it's a small population of people that we should just eradicate it and just say we shouldn't talk about it. I think Ireland is very distinct when it comes to talking about the conversation of racism, because Ireland has a history of being a racialized community, especially when it comes to the Americas itself. So there should be this empathy between white Irish people, let's say, and marginalized communities or communities of color. Whereas we've seen from previous research from, let's say, the Irish Network Against Racism in Ireland, they had a report where in 2020, there were 700 instances of racist attacks in Ireland, and that grew by 30% in the last year. But I can say that, okay, we don't know if that happened due to more people reporting or if it was an increase in itself. But it kind of shows that this is a phenomenon that really exists in Ireland, and we're not talking about it to the extent that we should. We're not having the policies and the legislation that is there to actually combat this on a productive level. So when we're talking about racism in Ireland, it needs to be talked about from both the individual experiences, but also at the structural and systematic level. So one of my pet peeves really is when people really talk about racism as like, oh, it's just the bad eggs in the pot. It's just the individual people that are doing A, B, and C and doing these attacks. Or the actual fact is those individuals, they have ideologies, they have ideas that come from somewhere. And those ideas come from a larger system, a larger structure that is perpetuating those ideas of superiority within them. And it's really important that we in Ireland, we actually, again, look at those individual experiences, look at those individual attacks, obviously do the things that we need to do to reduce them. But at the same time, we really need to look at the wider structures and the wider systems that influence, let's say, unhealthy nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiments that result in these attacks. So in order for us to really dismantle it in our contextual basis as well, we need to look at the wider structures that perpetuate, let's say in education, let's say in media, let's say in sport, let's say in politics. We really need to look at that as well. And one thing that we really need to look at with racism as well is that racism is not a black and white issue. That is another reason that I started Gorm Media as well. There's so many gray area, or let's say gray areas of beige that we need to look at it in that way. So there are communities that are even racialized as white that are the victims of racism in Ireland, and a lot of people don't even talk about it. That community I'm talking about, let's say the traveling community, the Roma community, that are racialized as white and are like, there's a report I read recently on the traveling community. They said it's the last form of acceptable racism in Ireland, and we're not really talking about it. Some people, they say, oh yes, oh, racism, I'm an ally to the Black community and things like that. But when you start to bring about other communities that may be the victims of racism, that is homegrown, let's say, the conversation kind of dies down. So it's really important that we look at the wider structures that may be influencing the let's say individual attacks in order for us to dismantle racism in the Irish context.
Absolutely, I think that's really important, and the fact that it is again a global phenomenon that is still very relevant to our own kind of locality in Ireland. So obviously as well, Claire, I'm just going to come to you next. Disability is another kind of global issue that is very hyper relevant in the Irish context as well. So, you know, you're a disability inclusion specialist, a role that I'm imagining, you know, 10 to 15 years ago probably wasn't very prevalent. So I definitely feel that the perception of people with disabilities has kind of changed during that period for sure. But in your opinion, what are some of the major blockers for people with disabilities who are looking for meaningful work in Ireland at the moment?
Okay, I'm glad to answer that question, but before I start, I'll do a visual description as well. So my name is Claire. I am a woman. I identify as a woman. My hair is brown, my skin is white. I'm wearing an orange sleeveless top today. And my background is my business pull-up, because you're right, Miriam, I started a business around business disability inclusion. And on the other side of me, you'll see a piece of assistive technology that I could not live without. It's a closed captioned TV. So when I get any content that is very written in very small print, I can put it under that and I can enlarge it so that I can see it and I can participate fully then in the working environment. And what are the blocks, for the systemic blocks around people with disabilities? There are so many. and so much parallels with what Mamobo has talked about as well. And I just want to echo that I do believe racism is alive and well in Ireland, and has been before we've ever become multicultural. When I was growing up, racism against the traveller community was very stark, and I have plenty stories around that. In terms of Ireland, I suppose, number one, disability is a very complex topic. Even within disability, it's hugely diverse. The definition of disability varies both nationally and internationally. So every piece of legislation that we have in Ireland has a different definition of disability. In terms of how people can define themselves as disabled, it can be anything from dyslexia to something that is very profound in terms of physical or intellectual or sensory disability. So it's very, very broad. It's complex in terms of the language, and then there's a lot of fear around that. And I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers that people with disabilities meet when they go for work, because we all have this unconscious bias, me included. Sometimes I have lots of clients who come to me and I go, how are you going to do that now? How are you going to get a job? How are we going to navigate that with that disability? You know, and it can be as simple things as getting to work, transport, you know, and it is also, there's a lot of myths and stereotypes around disability. The narrative around disability hasn't helped people with disabilities in Ireland. It's very much tragedy surrounded with charity, and tragedy and sympathy and oh, you poor thing, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do to ensure that we knock down these obstacles, and that people aren't fighting them as individuals, but as Mamobo just said, it's the systemic, it's the bureaucratic, it's everything, this legacy of negativity around disability, and really change the narrative. Plus, we've never really had great leadership around disability, but that has changed. And I think there are a few people in Ireland who have really changed that, and I have to call them out. It is Caroline Casey with the Valuable 500. So everyone should be following the Valuable 500 if they're supporting disability in the workplace and disability business inclusion. And Sinead Burke and Mark Pollock, like there's just so many leaders now who have disabilities and who are calling out the inadequacy of the system, whether it's education, sport, workplace, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I think the point you make about that sort of tragic narrative is really well articulated. I don't know if you've ever seen Stella Young's TED Talk, I Am Not Your Inspiration. It's brilliant about the kind of demeaning and like almost objectification of people with disabilities for the benefit of able-bodied people, really. But just to touch on, you know, you spoke about those limiting beliefs that people put on people with disabilities. What is, I suppose, the knock-on impact of that then when people go for, you know, job interviews or go to apply for roles? How does that actually materially manifest?
Well, I think many people, it's our own unconscious bias. And I often talk about what generation you belong to. So people in my generation, when I was in school, I wasn't born with my disability. I kind of inherited my disability at around the age of 19, okay? So I was in mainstream education. I saw very little disability. So when I went to the ophthalmologist and they told me you have a very rare eyesight condition, I never knew anybody who was blind, who was a leader in business in Ireland, or was up in the Dáil in Ireland, or was even one of my teachers in Ireland. There was no one on the path ahead of me who was openly vision impaired or blind and spoke positively about their life and being able to participate fully in their life. So I really didn't know what to do with it. So the limiting beliefs, even my own unconscious bias, is that we just think, how can someone do that job, you know? And that is one of the biggest barriers that people face. They also face systemic barriers in terms of like psychometric testing. People who are neurodiverse or vision impaired find them very hard to navigate. Interview processes. I was even on something recently with I was coaching a group of young blind people, and we had somebody in training around interview technique, and they said, you've got to keep eye contact. And after a while, I just had to say, sorry, I have to interrupt you. Like, we're all blind and vision impaired here. Like, we don't do eye contact, right? So we kind of have to reimagine the interview process and the job advertising process. And if we're really going to be inclusive, like some of the old things that we did, some of the customs or these traditions that we just expect are going to be there forever. You know, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but certainly we can reimagine how we can be more inclusive during the job process and the job getting the job recruitment process.
Yeah, they're definitely, I suppose, like, recruitment is a tricky one. It's hard to do recruitment well, and I think if you do open up your parameters for making a more inclusive, you know, candidate experience the whole way through, you will end up having knock-on effects to other communities as well, making it more inclusive. And actually, Paul, that kind of tees up to the kind of point of conversation I wanted to bring you in and around is, you have kind of spoken before previously on, you know, your experience of discrimination having applied for different kind of roles, or your negative experience at the very least of going through these applications. Could you tell the audience a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so just kind of in a nutshell, so I would have grown up in social housing flat complexes in the inner city, and kind of going back just to what we were talking about earlier, just kind of white people being racialized in Ireland. Well, when you had the tenements and mass poverty in the inner city, there was kind of a big bulk of the poor population that when all the tenements were being cleared, a lot of the flat complexes were built all around the inner city, and the poorest of the poor were put into these flat complexes. And like in the States, you had white flight, where you had a class flight in Dublin, where it was more the middle class had moved out to suburbia. So it was, when I was growing up as a kid, we were kind of just the ones left, and we were pretty much racialized, as in like, you were from the flat complexes, the way even the police treated us, the way services treated us, the social welfare as well, and there was a bit of mixing in that as well, and just that the traveling community, there was an effort to assimilate the traveling community, and going back years in the 60s as well, there was a big report on it. So a lot of the traveller community ended up in a lot of flat complexes as well. But just when I was growing up, I didn't really have that much of a formal education. I mean, my father couldn't read or write either. But when I wanted to try have a career and to get into like a job that people, you know, like a secure position, I went back and done my leaving cert. I went back and got a degree and then a postgraduate. And I noticed like all the people that I was in class with and stuff, they pretty much were going straight into what these are called graduate programs. And I didn't really understand how to get my foot in the door in any of them. And about a year and a half had gone by and I was still unemployed. And I was noticing with all the graduate programs, they're very similarly the structure and how they're all mapped out. So I'd need to put my junior cert results, junior cert school, leaving cert results, leaving cert school, internal employee reference, which is fairly discriminatory because you can only put that reference if you know someone who's in the company. And another thing that's very discriminatory about it is that a lot of companies give bonuses to the employee who gives that reference. So if the person is successful and gets through, the bonus that person can get, it can go from €500 up to a few grand, and depending on which company is doing it. So can you imagine a traveller or someone from the inner city, or in some cases migrants, who don't have any of those connections, any of those companies, and they're trying to even get to an interview level and you're being cut off. So they're asking the junior cert results, the leaving cert results, the employee reference, before they're even asking if you have the qualification or the competency which is suitable for the role. So every time I was applying, I could never get past the 4 stages. and it was just constantly and constantly. And I remember getting to I remember I got really annoyed with the employee reference scheme, and I rang up the recruiter and says, yeah, well, my ma worked as a cleaner for 6 years in your office, so can I put her down as a reference? And they kind of got embarrassed by the situation, and that's what I said to them. I was like, I literally live in the shadow of user offices. For people that's not familiar, in the inner city, you have Sheriff Street, and then you have the financial centre, and it's segregated by walls and gates. And we're pretty much like economically and socially segregated from the workforce there, where it's pretty much non-existent, anyone that works in any of these companies. So that was my experience, and then I thought I had hit lucky. I was learning Portuguese for a few years, and a Portuguese chap who worked for one of these companies said to me, they're looking for someone to sell their brand in Sao Paulo, and you have red hair, like you're a native English speaker, but you can speak Portuguese as well. It's not every day you come across someone. So as part of the application, I need to make a video application. Made the video application, and I didn't think anything more of it. And I think it was about a month and a half, 2 months later, he contacted me and asked me to meet up with him. And he met up with him. He was like, look, I'm leaving the company. I'm going to Portugal to work for a different company. But when we were talking about your application on WhatsApp, like as people do, it's just like, 'cause they get a good few applications and stuff in, they start joking about you, like being like, hey, did you get a load of the knacker speaking Portuguese? And then they were making jokes about us, like he's better off selling Dutch gold. And then another person in the WhatsApp conversation had said, guys, what's a knacker? And another person ripped back saying, oh, it's our version of white trash. And everyone was having a big giggle in the WhatsApp conversation. And he gave me the correspondence, and I tried to take a quality complaint. And this was in 2015. And basically the Workplace Relations Commission, because it wasn't one of the grounds, they were calling me, I don't want to repeat this word always, because it's so offensive, but just in the context that happened, in the fact they were calling me a knacker more because I'm from the inner city, me inner city Dublin accent as well. I couldn't take a quality complaint, even though I had correspondence with the people responsible for the recruitment, who were treating me unfairly. They weren't looking that I could actually speak Portuguese. So that kind of sparked off my passion. Like I grew up in the inner city, and I seen how we've been discriminated, how we've kind of been excluded and left out of the whole kind of push towards equality. And the other thing is, like, when you're growing up in the inner city and you see a lot of the companies have kind of jumped now kind of on certain social justice issues, but then we're still left off, and travellers are left off as well. And the anger that it puts inside you, and the tension that it breeds as well, is that for people growing up in the inner city, it's almost like there's a perception of a hierarchy of equality. So that sparked off my interest, and for the last few years, I've advocated and pushed hard to get the social-economic ground included in equality legislation. And essentially where it is at the moment, a commitment was given in the programme for government, and the government also will be have a consultation open at the moment, and I think the final date for submissions is October. So that's for the social economic ground to go into the equality legislation.
Thank you so much for both, sharing the work that you're doing, and also sharing that story. That's really horrific. I mean, if we were to put it in under any other sort of identity banner, if it was to do with someone being from a different race, it definitely would have been considered a little bit more carefully, I suppose, by that recruitment panel. So I'm so sorry to hear that was your experience. But
yeah, well, I think that what it is as well, like with that whole thing with people from inner city Dublin and travellers as well, as that it's that accepted form where people can smear, and some people who can be the most socially aware on certain issues, and then when it comes to class or the traveller community as well, in my experience, and I've with other people as well, it's just their consciousness and social awareness can literally just go out the window, and that's that accepted form of racism, accepted forms of classism that 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 is still kind of ongoing in Ireland. That while we may be becoming more aware of stuff because we're learning from social issues bubbling in America, that doesn't mean then that there's some stuff that's been going on here a long time that we can't just kind of like brush it under the carpet.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that term, you know, hierarchy of equality, that's one that really, it's quite, it really does hit home. I mean, naturally there isn't any sort of hierarchy. It's not like a point system. If it was, it would be a lot easier to kind of, you know, solve the issues. But yeah, like I think in my experience anyway, you often hear and you often see a lot of this work around specific identity dimensions. So, you know, women in tech, or, you know, LGBTQ pride, different things like that. And at the end of the day, like, class is one of the areas that people are the most marginalized based off their social class. And I think, you know, if we're not considering that intersectional lens, we're really just, you know, circulating different identities, and like making pathways, but for the most privileged people in society still. So it's about breaking down.
Well, absolutely. Like, and if you take even the Docklands workforce in Dublin, in where the Docklands has the highest rate of lone parents in the state, the biggest concentration, and they're all inner city women who are living the flat complexes all in and around all the offices. But they don't work in any of those companies, and they're not even being given kind of opportunities. There's no positive action measures. But although a lot of those companies will be kind of singing from the rooftops about their gender equality and equal pay, but there isn't a class element to it, or there's a class focus to it about, you know, like the opportunities that they could provide even at starting level, for a lot of women who are lone parents in the inner city. So that's the class element to it. Or even like my own mother, like, she worked as a cleaner in those offices, and that's as far as really a lot of kind of the jobs women are going to get in a lot of these companies that are from the area.
Yeah, and I know like these companies as well have the means to also provide things like childcare, which are so important for the kind of social mobility of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So it is important that, you know, we're all kind of stepping up, especially the IFSC being so centrally located. It's like it's such a contrast walking around the IFSC, seeing all the development that's been done, and then also seeing the communities that don't seem to be benefiting from it, other than kind of getting a tokenized sort of, oh, we'll come out and paint your walls or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another reason why I've been campaigning and pushing for that social economic ground, because at the moment we're still operating off a charity model, as in, for example, because social economic status isn't included in the equality legislation, a community group or like people from the community they don't have any rights-based tools to approach an employer, to approach a service, and to be like, look, you can do positive action measures on social economic status. Or if you are employing people in your job, well, a positive action measure would be that you give a certain amount of jobs to people actually from the area. But because there is protected grounds at the moment, you can, like, there isn't any uncertainty. Like, an employer can do that on age, they can do it on religion, they can do it on race. So it's just, it gives that extra power behind it. Also, it obligates the state, it obligates servers, it obligates employers to have code of practices if they're recording stats. So it will help where the issue that I've just talked about before, where social class sometimes gets left behind, or it's not, when we're talking about equality, it's not even at the table. So that's another reason why once it comes to statutory footing, it comes almost like the way we hear about data protection. You can't get away from it. It's just, you have to be compliant with it.
And you mentioned positive action there. I just want to kind of touch on that in terms of, like, what is positive action and how can different employers leverage it? Because it kind of has, it sits across all the kind of different dimensions that we're speaking about today.
Yeah. So essentially, so I'll give you a few little examples there of what positive action is. Positive action is kind of like affirmative action in the States. So, but under the equality legislation in Ireland, it's called positive action. So a positive action measure would be, say, for example, you have a lone parent and they're working in retail and you're the boss of this company, and the lone parent can only work 9 to 5 because that's the times the creche is at, and they wouldn't have financially the means to be able to get their child cared for after those hours. So they approach the boss and say, look, can you give me hours that's 9 to 5 Monday to Friday? Be great for me, because Jimmy there, he's a student and it suits him better to work evenings and weekends. Now, an employer doesn't have to give those hours, but can make a positive action measure because of family-friendly working hours, and give that lone parent those preferred hours rather than another person who doesn't have any family arrangements. And also there could be a student who actually suits me too. So that's a positive action measure. Or another positive action measure would be, say you're working in tech and it's mostly male dominated, and you get down to the final 2 applicants and they're very, very similar. The qualifications, the experience is really at the same. Well, a positive action measure would be to give the job then to, say, the female, because they're underrepresented in that area. But it's still very important. Their skills and background has to be very level. It couldn't be like, oh well, that person's, you couldn't unfairly discriminate against the male unless they were neck and neck. So that'd be another positive action measure. Or even like the access programs into college, they're positive action measures on class. So it's reducing the points for actually getting into a course, because it's accepting that historical association of going to a school that's from in a disadvantaged area. So that'd be another positive action measure.
Yeah, I think it's very important as well for companies and employers to know that they have that right, I suppose, and that they are protected to take those proactive measures to move forward and move the needle for different people. Claire, from your kind of experience, obviously working as an inclusion consultant, do you feel that there's more of an appetite now coming from different workspaces to create more disability friendly spaces, and that also go kind of beyond wheelchair accessibility? Because I know that's kind of a massive focus for people under the kind of disability access certificate. Are there additional measures that you're seeing that people are looking at?
100% yes. Look, we're in a very different place now in 2021 than we were even 10 years ago. I mean, Ireland signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities back in 2009, but we ratified it in 2018. Yet to sign the optional protocol. If anyone is here from the Dáil, you know, lads, sign it. So yeah, we're in a very different place. What I suppose, when I do, just to follow on there from something when Paul was talking about positive action also in terms of disability is education and training of all your employees, in terms of working with colleagues with disabilities, but also looking after your customers and your clients with people with disabilities. There's more than 1 billion of us around the world, and for any companies who are startups here and who are looking at the global stage, I suppose what I'd say to you is really, like, if we're looking at between 15 and 20% of the world's population being disabled, you know, are you actually making sure they're not buying your product or your service? You know, like, and by doing that, is your service not accessible? Is your website not accessible? Are the apps that you're designing not accessible? And it has to be done from the very beginning, really, you know. So intersectionality, I suppose what I always say in my trainings is, you know, disability can happen to anyone. You can be born with a disability, you can inherit a disability during your lifetime, or the most common is to actually acquire it, your disability, between the ages of 18 and 64 during your working age. And this can be as a result of an illness or an accident or lifestyle. So are there more things being done? Yes, I think there's a lot of education now and understanding around neurodiversity. And neurodiversity is a very broad term. It falls under disability as well. And neurodiversity includes autism, for example, but it also includes like dyslexia, dysgraphia, you know, dyscalculia, etc. And most of the organizations that I'm working with, they're all really on board around that. I mean, they have assistive technology catalogs, so they know exactly what they already have in their organizations and what's easy to get and what works and what doesn't work. And I suppose what's really important is to have those conversations. Look, this doesn't work. And are also not to assume that what might work for Claire might work for everyone else who's vision impaired. It doesn't, you know, we all use different pieces of assistive technology. But I think what's really important, I suppose, we can't talk about anything around disability without talking about the present situation, a global pandemic, right? Where people are, you know, their mental health, as well as their physical health, having, if they've got this disease and recovered, may be impacted. So disability is a very dynamic term, and what disability was 20 years ago is very different today, and what it will be in the next 10 years is very different, you know. So all the employers, and I call them leaders, to the people who I'm working with, they want to do the best for their employees. And if you want to do the best for your employees, then you have to have an understanding of disability, neurodiversity, and looking after mental health, right? We don't want to have more mental illness. We all have mental health, and we have to look after it just like we have to look after our physical health.
Absolutely. And I mean, like, again, that's one of those parameters that if you design interventions in your company based around mental health, it's not going to just benefit one, like the disabled folks coming in, it's going to benefit everybody in your organization. So I love that description you said around, you know, some people are born with disabilities, other people have temporary disabilities. I mean, the best infographic that I've seen of this is Microsoft have this inclusive design toolkit, and they kind of map out different sort of situational, temporary, and like permanent disabilities, and how, you know, somebody could be, you know, holding something in one hand and not be able to open a door properly, or they could have an injured arm, or they could have no arm at all, you know. And if you're designing I suppose a system that's inclusive of somebody who has that long term, everybody else in between is going to be kind of impacted by that design as well. But yeah, it's great to hear, I suppose, that there is, that conversation is moving forward and there is more appetite, because sometimes I would worry that it's just very much focused on physical disability and not other elements.
No, I think the population, sorry now, but I think the population is becoming more educated around what disability is, and we're having more open conversations about it. And, you know, there's less denial around what disability is. And can I just say, because I mean, so much of it is around allies. Like, I'm the only person in my family who has a disability. The 3 people I live with, I say, you know, they've got front row seats, right? And when I go into organizations, the people who usually bring me into the organization isn't necessarily the disabled person. It's the person who either has a brother or a sister or a child with a disability, and they've got that front row seat, and they know that they have to do something in their organization, because they're like, what about when my kid grows up? Is he or she going to get a job in this company? Or is it only for people like me who are fully, you know, their bodies work properly? And look, the chances of all of your bodies working properly for the next 80 or 90 years, however long you're going to inhabit this planet, right, it's very unlikely. So really, everyone, I mean, according to the World Health Organization, everyone at some stage of their life would experience disability, whether it's temporary or permanent, you know. And I suppose, just to throw it out to the audience there, just imagine if a switch went now and every single person had a disability. How are you going to like finish this call? How are you going to get home tonight? How are you going to do your job tomorrow? How are you going to feed your kids? All right, so disability is like, it's very raw. And when it happens, it's a huge medical thing that society puts on you. But as well as that, doors close, right? So it's not just like you're managing this massive change in your life, and then literally other things are just taken off you, you know. You can't do this and you can't do that. So, you know, it is a conversation. I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and that it's very intersectional as well, because disability impacts everyone, whether you're Black or white or Hindu or Christian or Irish or from the Lebanon. Everyone can be impacted at some stage during their life by disability.
Yeah, definitely. And I do love the point that you brought up about allyship and the role of allies, because it is it's vitally important, I think, across all the dimensions of identity that like are kind of represented on this call and beyond, that it's people who are in the organizations advocating for this, who are calling people up on their, you know, defamatory language, who are, you know, questioning folks on their logical thinking and saying, is that rooted in fact, or is that rooted in your own biases, or, you know, your opinions, if you want to lessen the blow a little bit. But very super important. And I think as well, you know, Mamobo, just to bring you back in, we saw some really intense like sort of racism play out in sport with the kind of the England at the end of the Euros 2020, and you know, just between the kind of English nationalists and people who are assumed of kind of migrant background. And I feel like your role, I suppose, in bringing people together on this kind of neutral platform for discussion, it's a very proactive role you're taking, and it's you know, it is, you're being very much an ally to both groups, I would think, doing that. So would you think, just given your experience and obviously the fact that you set up Gorm Media, do you think Ireland is also at risk of this increasing polarization between, you know, racialized white people and people who are assumed to be of migrant kind of heritage?
To keep it short, yes. So yes, I think especially because in the last year, we have been kind of going into this more online space, and it's a space where we can be, one, anonymous, and there are no sort of physical or, let's say, legal repercussions of the things we say. So I think that can sort of it has us sort of like retreat into our bubbles, where we don't really hear the opinions, we don't hear the takes, we don't listen to people who are in our immediate circle. So it's really important that we really engage with other people rather than engaging with people saying, no, my opinion is right, and you have to hear what I'm saying, things like that. This is just me coming from my psychology background. If you have to engage with people with an air of listening to them, even though you don't agree with anything that they're saying, you want to just listen to them to kind of point out areas in which may be, let's say, defamatory or maybe discriminatory, in order for them to realize it's not about changing somebody's mind. It's about planting a seed in their head for them to do that work themselves. And I know we were talking about allyship and having people that are there who do advocate for us as well. And I would argue that we should even move beyond allyship to this sense of like coalition, meaning that we need to find that common ground between all the sorts of activism and advocacy work that we're doing in order to move forward together in a more, let's say, unified approach. I think all of us here has felt the sense of I don't know, discrimination, or has felt discriminated against at some point. And if we hone into that sort of feeling, we can actually move mountains, I believe. I think we can create that common ground in which we can work with corporations, work with businesses for them to have that EDI agenda moving forward. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about intersectionality, and we're talking about identity and things like that, when we have these sort of different pockets of identity, and it's really important to have those safe spaces for identity and things like that, but sometimes we often retreat into those identity factors, where the fact is that we as human beings, we're super multifaceted, and we have so many things that are going on in our lives that add to this sense of who we are. So in order for us to do that, we should build, let's say, coalitions between each other so we can learn from each other and see each other as not only being different, but just as humans at the end of the day, and see that common element of humanity. So I think in order for us to, let's say, retreat from this sort of polarized world that we're coming into, we should come together and see our humanity first and foremost. And then from that, we can talk about the differences that we have.
That's a really incredible sort of inspirational sentiment, that moving beyond allyship to a coalition, that really brings home for me. I'm conscious that we're coming up against time, so I wanted to give time to the audience to ask any questions. Like, I'd send a few prompts. There's a lot of comments coming in thanking the speakers for their contributions, but I'm just scrolling through now to see if there's any solid questions. No, okay, well, maybe then we'll just come. Oh, there's Rick's got one for us. didn't notice about that.
Okay, I'll how can I put it? I'll please forgive me if it sounds very ignorant on what I'm going to ask or something. Now, I'm someone who's almost here 20 years, and I'm more I relate more to certain points than others, obviously. but something that, especially what Paul was mentioning, I sent a message about that, is that I admit I unfortunately fell into the mindset of what's been told to me when I moved over to Ireland, how other from what you mentioned, class systems are in Ireland, from traveller community and so on, and certain parts of Cork and Dublin and Limerick and other counties that that comes to mind right now, and which is how can I put it? Like, which is kind of disturbing to me after I've been kind of been interacted with more people from these communities in the past few years, recently years, and that opened my eyes to it, and it made me realize like it's wrong the way my mindset, and what are your thoughts on that, on how to shift that mindset? I know there's the positive, no, there's the professional side of it, which you mentioned, Paul, especially, and if anyone else has thoughts, it'd be great as well. And then there's also the social element side of it, the outside the work office hours, which probably seems to be more common to talk about and tease out on in the pub or somewhere like the usual places that things like this would come out, more racism might come out than the office spaces.
Yeah, you raise a really good point there. So I think what kind of happens, and history has shown, it kind of repeats itself no matter the setting that it happens in, is that you probably have read about this even when the Irish, how bad they were treated when they went to the States, was that when they were like living in ghettos, what way to kind of move their status up was whoever was unfortunate there as well. You had Italians, you had African Americans as well, was to treat them worse to get past and to be accepted in society. And I've almost seen a similar thing happen with some new communities in Ireland, in that when people are arriving into Dublin, you can have a lot, say even Brazilian nationals, very well educated, really good qualifications, but when they come to Ireland, they are on the lowest social ladder, even though they have the qualifications. They speak Portuguese, they speak English, they might speak Spanish as well, and they find themselves a lot of the time they're living in the most poorest communities, as in Summerhill, in and around the inner city, and they learn from their peers as well, and they'll be like, well, that's the K-word people, that's the people that you need to stay away from. And then when they mix with Irish people as well, they hear that. So it comes almost like a thing of othering. It's, well, I'm not like them. I'm not like that. I live in that area, but I want to work. I want to better myself. And it's a stereotype kind of thing, then a generalization that's how the continuation of people getting othered. And I brought this up last year even. It was a thing I was aware of that was festering for years on social media. There was really well professional videos being made, which was depicting the traveller community, depicting the inner city community as rapists, as robbers, as murderers, pretty much like a whole generalization of what everyone is like. And for English language students, you go online, and if I was going to live in another country, is Naples a safe place? Is Paris a safe place to live? And the first things you're seeing is this thing about the traveller people, the inner city people, and this is what our new communities are learning. So it is a difficult situation. One thing that I've tried to recommend anyway was that with the English language schools, was that they're more regulated, and that the English language teachers, if they are found to be teaching this, because some of them were teaching this kind of narrative, that they could get into serious trouble. The other thing, the unfortunate thing, is that a lot of the social media content reviewers like Facebook, Instagram, and the words knacker are words around people from the inner city, are travellers. When you report those words, if people are putting up videos, you can't get them took down, because they're their community standards sometimes come from a fairly Americanized civil rights version, and it doesn't infringe their community standards. Especially if it's on social class. Sometimes when it's on the traveller ground, you can, but still. And the content just festers and festers, and people in our communities look at how it's just being allowed to run rampant, and you can't get it took down. So that's another reason why we want to get that social economic ground in as well, because when people are in encouraging hate, encouraging violence, encouraging this kind of rhetoric, and you can't get it took down, or there's no consequences the way there would be if it was other grounds. This is where the tension develops also. So it is a hard issue to solve, and it is something, if you look in any countries, the Irish done it as well. In the States, they tried to they tried to get above the Italians and the African Americans that they were living next to try better themselves, to be, you know. And that's a similar thing that's happening, just in my experience with new communities in the inner city. But it was great that you raised that point.
Thanks. Mamobo, sorry, you have something.
I just wanted to add something to that. It was a really great point that Paul was saying, and it's really telling that, especially what you were talking, psychologically speaking, that it's called horizontal hostility, when there's this perceived hierarchy between communities, and those who are in the marginalized communities, in order for them to progress up in this perceived hierarchy, they start to fight between each other because there's this thing of resources that they want to get to the hierarchy. But in order for us to combat that and combat those prejudices that we have against communities that aren't in our immediate circle, or communities that we perceive to be A, B, and C in a bad way, you can either do it in sort of like a bottom-up approach, meaning that you as the individual, you actively try to dismantle these ideas that you have been fed by, let's say, the media, or let's say whatever, other people, things that you may have been seeing. So this is exactly what you're doing here, Emmerich, like talking with people in these communities, debunking the stereotypes that you have in your head, reading about these communities and the hardships that they have gone through. And also, like, even if you meet someone in the pub and you see someone saying a bad joke and like challenging those jokes and things like that, that's sort of like a bottom-up approach. And from the top-down approach, which is even harder because they're the ones that are sort of perpetuating these ideas, is we need to challenge the politics behind the politics and the media and the education systems that are filtering these ideas to the everyday person, and they want to filter in a way that it seems like common sense, where it's actually really not. It's laced in discrimination. So we really need to challenge it on both levels in terms of how these communities are being treated and represented in the real world. So I just wanted to add that there.
What a phenomenal closing thought, Mamobo. Yeah, very, very true. It's bottom up and it's top down, and it's, you know, we've got to be those kind of allies every single day for all of the communities and everything that we're aware of. And we should all be, again, having that kind of learning mindset, learning from other people's personal experiences, learning from experts as well, because, you know, sometimes personal experiences are just anecdotal. We have to be mindful and respectful of them, of course, but you know, not everybody's personalized experience is going to represent the major group. So we do have to, but look, we're just up against time now, so I'm just going to close off by saying, if anybody on the call does want to make a submission for that consultation that Paul was talking about, it's going to be in the follow-up email that goes after this, as well as links to both Mamobo, Claire and Paul's kind of social media accounts and their websites as well. So thank you very much to all the panelists and to Republic of Work for hosting us today. It was a really great conversation. It will be recorded and it should be shared, I hope so. So if anybody wants to watch it back, feel free to. But again, thank you so much, Mamobo, Claire and Paul, and Rick and Angie as well for hosting this event.
Okay, shall I close? I guess. So yeah, to finish off, just again, repeating Miriam's closing as well. Thanks everyone for joining us. Just two things quickly before we finish off. There's a survey that Angie is going to be sharing. I think she already did. If she didn't, she would be putting it there. It's called republicforward.com/event feedback. Please, would love to hear from you. Would love to know your thoughts, what your and how we could be better and in any aspect of topics. And make sure that you tune in for next Tuesday. Our next lunch and learn is going to be on the power of promotional marketing. Completely different topic to what we have now, but it's also there's a great, we could utilize our marketing, promotional marketing, for our social inclusion as well. So thank you so much. Have a beautiful day, and goodbye.